contractor protected or indemnified. And again, it's a complicated legal issue. I don't want to give a blanket statement. That's a little different than the issue you raised with Boeing, which is there simply such a risk of getting sued? Forget whether at the end of the day you win the lawsuit, but you have to get a lawyer, you have to deal with a certain amount of legal hassle. Is there so much, such a high transaction cost surrounding that you're going to get contractors who simply don't want to do anything because they just don't want to get pulled into having to be in court and getting enmeshed in all these kinds of proceedings? And by the way, what's interesting about the Boeing thing is the argument, it shows how far this argument can extend, because it's not just it's a question of not actually doing the rendition itself, but simply providing the airplane. I mean, I guess the guy who makes the pencils and the pens that are used to sign a piece of paper that orders something, he could be sued because he's creating pens and pencils. This is actually less to do with the role of contractors in government than it has to do with problems in the legal system, which has now become a tool of combat. If you don't like a policy, you sue or you try to create legal problems in an effort to raise the temperature and hopefully cause people to shrug their shoulders and say, I don't want to help the government because if I engender controversy, I'm going to pay an economic cost. I think the guy who's CEO of Whole Foods now is experiencing a little of this, maybe not in terms of being sued, but in terms of kind of the temperature being raised in the public media. So to me, this is not really an issue about contractors as much as it is an issue about the legal system. I do think the one thing that is worth saying, though, is that contractors may be in a little bit of a different legal position than government employees, and that's something which I think is a contractor's issue, and that's why they need to think through very carefully what they do, what they don't do, and how to protect themselves with respect to things which do create a certain amount of legal risk.
But it's not just a contractor problem, it becomes a government problem. If, I mean, when you ran Homeland Security, you were part of the intelligence community.
Correct. Yeah.
You hired outside contractors to do some terrorist threat assessment, to do some sensitive intelligence functions, right?
Right.
You depended on them.
Yeah,
right?
and the government absolutely, by the way, not restricted just to intelligence. In the law enforcement community, it's not uncommon to have contractors perform certain kinds of functions, whether it's a security function, guarding courthouses, whether it's an analytic function. I mean, the idea that there's this clear line between government and non-government is simply not borne out by the reality of government activity across the board, not just intelligence.
But if you want to hire outside contractors on an ongoing basis, which seems to be what's going on in the intelligence community, we're kind of rent a spies in a sense. You're going to have a problem if contractors are going to realize they'll be facing liability, right?
I don't think there's any question that it's in the government's interest to make sure that there are the kinds of protections for contractors who are operating in good faith that we want to see with respect to government officials. That's why we have the laws always created various kinds of immunities to give people some space within which they can operate without being in legal jeopardy as long as they're operating in good faith. Part of the undercurrent of this discussion is, well, why do we need contractors? And the truth is we need contractors because, first of all, as General Hayden said, there are skills that we don't normally have in the government that we may have an immediate requirement for. And there also may be skills, by the way, that we don't have a continuing requirement for. For example, there was probably not a lot of emphasis in the community 10 years ago on Pashtun speakers, and now there's probably a high demand for that. It may be in 10 years the demand for Pashtun speakers will not be there anymore, and we'll be interested in people who speak dialects in Africa or dialects in Southeast Asia. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to bring people in to permanent career positions for a skill that may be needed for a very specific period of time at a surge level. So it's very much in the interest of government's efficiency to make sure you have the flexibility to surge and deal with specialized requirements in a flexible way.
Therefore, the law should basically deal with this issue if the government's going to continue to hire.
Yeah, if you're going to expect contractors to do the work, you will have to give them a measure of legal protection that is necessary to allow them to do it.
I want to bounce one thing back to General Hayden and then talk to Jack. So when you took over as the head of the CIA, there was a time shortly before you took over that the CIA